Picture this. You're kneeling in a candlelit chapel beneath the vaulted stone ceiling of Santa Maria in Aracoeli, and the air smells like burnt incense and sweat. It's late, nearly midnight in the spring of 1497, and the Vatican looms just beyond the darkened hills. You were summoned not by God, but by something far more terrifying, the will of the Borgia. Somewhere outside, horses snort and clatter on cobbled streets, slick with wine and blood. The bells have long stopped ringing. Rome is drunk. Rome is dangerous. And inside this holy place, beneath the golden eyes of saints carved in wood and marble, a wedding is about to begin. Not between lovers, not between families, but between ambition and perversion, greed and sin, and a brother and sister who are far more intimate than any vows spoken before the altar. Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, stands beside his sister Lucrezia, eyes locked on her lips, not her hand. She is dressed in white, but this is no virgin bride. She smiles like a knife hidden beneath silk. Everyone in the chapel knows. Everyone in the chapel stays silent, because to speak the truth here is to die. There are no words, no hymns, no witnesses worth their breath. There is only power stitched in the bloodline of one of the most corrupt families Christendom has ever known, the House of Borgia. But to understand how a pope's son could become a murderer, a cardinal, and a lover to his sister, all in the same breath, you must first understand the man who made him. Rodrigo Borgia, the patriarch of this dynasty of sin, the man the world would come to know as Pope Alexander VI. Rodrigo, born in Spain and raised on a doctrine of dominance, slithered his way up the ecclesiastical ladder, not through holiness, but through bribery, deception, and a libido that seemed more Roman than Christian. By the time he became Pope in 1492, he already had children, lots of them, with multiple mistresses. But Cesare was different. He wasn't just Rodrigo's son. He was his shadow, his sword, his heir in everything but name. And Lucretia, oh Lucrezia, the golden daughter, the one born with eyes like her mother's and cunning like her father's. Lucrezia was the ornament of the Vatican, paraded like a holy relic at the feast table of Europe. Every duchy and kingdom desired her hand, and Cesare ensured only those he approved ever got close, because no one touched his sister without tasting his wrath. From the moment Cesare was old enough to speak, he was groomed for power. Not sainthood, not purity, power. His father forced him into the church, made him a cardinal before he could grow a beard, dressed him in robes dyed with the blood of lesser men. And Cesare hated it, hated the lies, hated the confinement. He wanted to taste flesh, to break bones, to conquer. And when his younger brother Juan, a military commander, died under mysterious circumstances, stabbed multiple times and thrown into the Tiber, many whispered Cesare's name behind locked doors. But no one dared speak it aloud, because Juan was an obstacle. Cesare didn't like obstacles, and now Juan was gone, drowned in the river like trash. And Cesare, freed from his brother's shadow, removed his cardinal robes and picked up the sword. It was the first time in papal history that a cardinal renounced his title, and it was done with the Pope's blessing, because Rodrigo knew his son was meant for blood, not blessings, and blood he gave. Cesare was no ordinary warlord. He was handsome, charismatic, and vicious, a serpent in velvet. When he rode into battle, he wore golden armor and carried a black banner emblazoned with a single burning bull, his personal sigil, the Borgia beast. Entire cities surrendered at the sight of it. Lords vanished, families fell. He conquered central Italy one principality at a time, each with a smile on his lips and a dagger behind his back. But all that violence, it wasn't the scandal. It was what happened in Rome, within the walls of the Vatican, Lucrezia remained. Married, annulled, remarried again. Her husbands always seemed to die. The first, Giovanni Sforza, was sent packing when Cesare and Rodrigo accused him of impotence. Publicly humiliated, forced to sign a document declaring himself unable to satisfy her, the man fled in disgrace. The second, Alfonso of Aragon, was more beloved. A charming young man with a kind heart and noble blood. And for a time, Lucrezia seemed genuinely happy, pregnant, hopeful. But Cesare saw Alfonso as a threat, not just to power, but to proximity, because Cesare didn't want to share her, not with anyone. So one night, as Alfonso walked the halls of the Vatican unarmed, assassins emerged from the shadows. They beat him, left him bleeding, but he didn't die, not right away. He clung to life in Lucrezia's arms for weeks, slowly healing under her care. Cesare visited him, smiled, and then returned later with a rope. Alfonso was strangled in his sickbed. No witnesses, no justice, just silence. The kind of silence that sticks in the lungs of history like dust. Lucrezia mourned, or pretended to, but she didn't leave, couldn't leave. She was no longer just the Pope's daughter. She was the Duchess of Ferrara, the bride of alliances, the pawn of power. Yet behind every closed door, the rumors grew louder. That Cesare spent too much time in her chambers, that the way his hand lingered on her back, the way their eyes locked across the banquet table, was not brotherly love. There were letters, whispers from ambassadors, gossip from servants. Even the poet Pietro Bembo wrote of her beauty with a tone that suggested she was the most dangerous woman in Rome. Not because of her ambition, but because of the men around her. Cesare and Lucrezia weren't just siblings. They were soulmates forged in fire and ambition, inseparable in mind and many believed in body. And if Rome noticed, Rome didn't speak, because the Borgia name was carved in iron and wine and terror. Back in the Vatican, Rodrigo, Pope Alexander, indulged in orgies that made pagan Rome seem tame. He drank from goblets carved with nude saints. He held banquets where prostitutes danced naked on tables shaped like crosses. The holy city became a brothel painted with gold. One night in 1501, a feast known as the Banquet of Chestnuts was held in the Vatican. Cesare, Lucrezia, Rodrigo, all in attendance. Servants described 50 courtesans dancing nude among the cardinals, competing to pick up chestnuts scattered across the marble floor with their mouths. The Pope watched. Cesare laughed. Lucrezia smiled. And when the guests retired to their chambers, no one knows exactly who went with whom. But one chamber, it's said, had only two names on its door. Cesare, Lucrezia. The child born the next year was named Giovanni, and his parentage remains the subject of speculation to this day. Officially, he was listed as the son of Lucrezia's third husband, Alfonso d'Este, but some records suggest another name entirely, Pope Alexander VI, Lucrezia's father, or perhaps Cesare himself. Giovanni Borgia, the child with two birth certificates, the boy no one could explain, the heir to a secret so toxic that even the Vatican tried to erase it. By the time Rodrigo died in 1503, collapsing during another feast, mouth foaming with poison or perhaps divine retribution, Lucrezia had already faded from public life. She took to Ferrara, devoted herself to charity, to poetry, to prayer, as if trying to wash the blood off her hands with holy water. Cesare, on the other hand, tried to hold on to power. But with Rodrigo gone, the Borgia grip loosened. Rivals rose, alliances shattered, and Cesare, once the golden lion of Rome, found himself hunted. He died on a rainy night in 1507 in a ditch in Navarre, stabbed and naked, stripped by his enemies. His body was left to rot in the mud. No ceremony, no requiem, just rain. The man who had lived like Caesar died like a dog. Lucrezia died later, peacefully, in a bed of roses, but alone. Some say she kept a portrait of Cesare by her bedside until the end. Their story was buried, censored, but not forgotten, because some sins are too big to silence. And the Vatican, no matter how many saints it canonizes, will always carry the blood of the Borgia. Cesare and Lucrezia, brother and sister, prince and duchess, lovers perhaps, monsters certainly, but above all, human. Human in their need, human in their hunger, human in their ruin. And though time has turned their story into legend, into scandal, into whispers behind stained glass, the truth remains lodged like a splinter in the spine of history, that in the heart of the holiest city on earth, sin wore a crown and called itself family. The bells of San Pietro ring hollow in the early dawn, their sound bouncing off marble and bone, filling Rome's alleys like a ghost's whisper. The Vatican has not slept. Not really. Not since the arrival of the Spanish cardinal and his bastard son. The boy who was once an outsider now strides barefoot through papal corridors, his silk robes dragging behind him like spilled wine across the stone floor. Cesare Borgia is no longer merely the Pope's bastard. He is now the sharpest blade in the Vatican's arsenal, and the holy city itself seems to flinch when he passes. There's a peculiar stillness to the Vatican now, a tension just beneath the hymns and incense. The guards, those still loyal to Alexander VI, watch with downcast eyes as Cesare moves through the apostolic palace, trailing behind him a procession of silence and fear. At 22, Cesare no longer resembles the golden boy painted in the halls by obedient artists. His face has hardened. The curve of his mouth no longer holds charm but calculation. His eyes, once worshipped for their beauty, now burn with something more primal: possession, fury, hunger. The city whispers of his brother Juan's disappearance, how the body surfaced, bloated in the Tiber, stabbed a dozen times with such force that even the river could not carry it gently. No one dares speak the name of the assassin aloud, but every nobleman and every cardinal knows. Only one man had both the motive and the audacity to murder a son of the Pope. Juan, the favored one. Juan, the military commander. Juan, the legitimate heir in name if not in spirit. He was everything Cesare was not allowed to be, and for that, he died choking on water and blood. Cesare had spent his youth in robes, forced into the cloth to give the Borgia name holy credibility. But no amount of Latin or liturgical pageantry could cage the fire boiling in his chest. He wanted swords, not sacraments. He wanted flesh, not faith. And now he had both. It is said the Pope wept for Juan as any father would, but behind closed doors he spoke only of balance, of symmetry, of necessity. For every great house requires pruning, and so Cesare, freed from the shackles of priesthood by papal decree, laid aside his cassock and took up armor that gleamed like judgment. He would be Rome's avenger. He would be his father's sword. But those who knew Cesare closely, those few still alive, murmured of a deeper wound than rivalry, a deeper obsession than legacy. For his bond with his sister Lucrezia was not the bond of ordinary blood. Rome is a city built on lies, but even it struggled to hide this one. The whispers had begun years before, when Lucrezia was still barely a girl, not yet 13, and her brother watched her dance through the colonnades like a thing too fragile for the world. Her golden hair, her delicate laugh, the way she clutched Cesare's hand at banquets as though he were not her brother, but her betrothed. Courtiers smiled too politely. Nobles drank too quickly. Behind their masks, they all asked the same question. What is she to him? What has she already become? And yet no one intervened. For who would challenge the Pope's own blood? Alexander VI, once Rodrigo Borgia, had woven a kingdom not through prayer, but through favors, threats, and the ancient power of inheritance. He married Lucrezia off like a pawn, first to Giovanni Sforza, a noble too weak to protest when she was ripped from him and the marriage annulled on grounds of impotence. Cesare had laughed when the letters were drawn, watched gleefully as the proud Sforza line was reduced to gossip and ruin, because no man would have his sister, no man would claim what was his. When Lucrezia was remarried to Alfonso of Aragon, even that was a strategy, meant to forge an alliance with Naples. But Cesare seethed. Alfonso was kind, handsome, and perhaps even loved her in some soft, sincere way. That made it worse, because when Cesare visited her chambers unannounced, when he brushed a lock of her hair behind her ear, with the possessiveness of a lover, not a sibling, she did not recoil. It was Lucrezia who shielded their secret best of all. With the innocence of a saint and the cunning of a serpent, she smiled at cardinals and curtsied to queens. She wrote poetry about love in winter, painted doves and roses in the margins of holy texts. But behind her doll-like expression was a mind sharp as glass, and a heart long since devoured by the people who claimed to love her, because Lucrezia never got to choose. Not her name, not her body, not even her fate. She was the hinge upon which Vatican power swung. A marriage here, an annulment there, and always the price paid in her skin, her womb, her silence. When Alfonso grew too independent, when he stopped attending papal banquets and began questioning Cesare's ever-growing control over the city, it was not political, it was personal. He had insulted the wrong Borgia. One night in the halls of the Vatican, screams echoed that no one acknowledged. Alfonso had been attacked on the steps, strangled by hired men who claimed later to be thieves. But he survived. For a while. He lay bandaged in Lucrezia's chambers, drifting in and out of consciousness, clinging to life like a wounded animal. She fed him soup with trembling hands. She kissed his brow and whispered that everything would be all right. But it wasn't. Cesare arrived in the dead of night. No guards, no witnesses, only a pillow and silence. By morning, Alfonso was dead. The cause was listed as internal bleeding, injuries from the attack, the scribes wrote. But everyone knew. Lucrezia's eyes were red at Mass, but her face betrayed no surprise. She sat beside Cesare as he knelt for communion, their shoulders brushing, their gazes never meeting. And still the city said nothing, because Rome was bleeding too. It bled from its nobility, torn apart by papal politics. It bled from its merchants, strangled by tithes and debt. It bled from the poor, dying in the gutters while the Pope built towers of gold. And it bled from within the Borgia family itself, from the unnatural, unbearable knot between brother and sister. Cesare's power only grew. He was made Duke of Valentinois by the French crown, granted military command, and sent forth to carve out a new Italian empire in his family's name. He conquered cities not with holy banners, but with fire and betrayal. His enemies were disemboweled and hung from balconies, their wives paraded through the streets naked, symbols of submission. Yet Cesare never smiled more fully than when returning to Rome, to Lucrezia, as though each conquered province was just another token to lay at her feet. There was no boundary he would not cross for her, no oath he would not break. And she? She had learned to wield him like a blade. At the court of Ferrara, where her third marriage placed her after Alfonso's death, Lucrezia wrote long letters to Cesare. They were filled with poetry and riddles, religious imagery blended with lines so intimate they could not be mistaken for anything but love. To you I send the softest part of my soul, one letter read. May your lips never forget where they have kissed, and your hands remember the curve of what they should not hold. Scholars argue about the authenticity. Some claim forgery, others suggest metaphor, but those who have read the originals in quiet Vatican archives say the truth is in the ink itself, the slant of a hand too practiced, too natural to fake. And in Cesare's own replies, sparse, precise, but always delivered in person whenever possible, because he could never stay away long. His campaigns brought him glory and horror in equal measure. He razed towns, poisoned wells, buried rivals alive in their own cellars. And still, he returned to Rome like a lover coming home. It wasn't just power that drove him. It was the need to be seen by her, to have her eyes on him and no other. Even when she birthed children by other men, Cesare found reasons to linger in her presence, watching how she held the infants, how she whispered their names, as if comparing them to some imagined future that only he could give her. But Rome was watching, and Rome does not forgive. Rumors began to fester into rebellion. Cardinals whispered not just of incest, but of demonic influence, of a family so corrupt, so consumed by sin, that even divine judgment was inevitable. Pamphlets spread in the night, unsigned but eloquent, calling the Borgias the Antichrist's household, and for once, even Cesare could not kill fast enough to stem the tide. Still, he refused to let go. When Pope Alexander VI lay dying, his face twisted in agony, perhaps poisoned, perhaps merely reaping what he had sown, Cesare never left his side. He held his father's hand, and in his eyes there was no grief, only calculation. Power was slipping, and he knew it. The moment Alexander died, the Borgia grip on Rome would unravel. Lucrezia would be a pawn again. He would be a hunted man, and nothing, not even blood, could stop it. So he plotted. He tried to install a puppet pope. He tried to forge new alliances, but it was too late. The tide had turned. Rome, like a scorned lover, wanted vengeance. And so it went, the Borgia name sliding deeper into infamy with every silk-laced lie whispered behind the marble columns of the Vatican. The candlelit hallways of the papal palace bore silent witness to a family dynasty rotting from within. Its foundations not stone, but secrets, betrayal, and forbidden lust. The city around them, Rome, ancient and exhausted, trembled under the weight of holiness, desecrated by blooded indulgence, its churches crumbling beneath the sin of those sworn to sanctity. Cesare, now no longer satisfied by the shadowed life of a cardinal, turned his gaze outward, to power that did not dress itself in vestments, but rode on horseback and bled beneath iron and steel. His robes grew tighter, suffocating him with every sermon, every empty sacrament muttered while his father gestured from the Holy See as if the world had not seen his bastard children grow fat on bribes and lust. Cesare's soul roared for war. He wanted kingdoms, not cloisters. He wanted to carve his name into the skin of Italy. But still, his most fevered obsession lingered within palace walls: Lucrezia. She had now become a political pawn passed from man to man, each marriage arranged not for love or alliance, but to protect her father's rule and conceal the unspoken truth that twitched just beneath the surface of every papal banquet. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, noble in name and little else, was discarded with accusations of impotence, though everyone whispered that the marriage had been annulled because he had walked in on something he should not have seen. Cesare's lips on Lucrezia's neck, her laugh curling around his ear like incense smoke. Giovanni fled, denounced and ruined, but not before accusing Pope Alexander VI himself of orchestrating incest between his children. Rome's whispers turned into roars, but the Pope did what all-powerful men do. He crushed the accusation beneath gold and gallows, silencing tongues with bribes and threats alike. Cesare, meanwhile, shed his cardinal robes with terrifying ease, and stepped into the world as a nobleman of war. But his love for Lucrezia never dimmed. It smoldered. He rode through cities aflame with her name stitched beneath his skin, her letters tucked into his armor, her scent lingering on his hands long after she had been wed to another. This time, Alfonso of Aragon, handsome, young, and doomed. Lucrezia had wept at the altar, her tears not for the man she married, but for the one who stood watching in silence. Cesare, his jaw set like stone, his fingers white against the hilt of his sword. She tried, truly, to love Alfonso. He was kind, and for a brief time, they found a fragile peace. But peace is a fragile thing in the orbit of Cesare Borgia. And Alfonso had the misfortune of being more than a husband. He was a threat, a whisper of independence for Lucrezia, a line drawn between her and her brother's suffocating possessiveness. One night, beneath a moonless sky, assassins crept into Alfonso's chamber. The blades were silent but ruthless. He did not die then, but lingered, bloody and broken, in a bed soaked with fear and fever. Lucrezia sat beside him, her fingers clasped in prayer, though her eyes looked not toward heaven, but toward the heavy door behind which she knew Cesare stood. She begged for Alfonso's life, wept at her father's feet, threatened to flee. But it was all theatre now. Cesare had tasted the fruit of war, and he would not let a husband come between him and his sister. Days later, Cesare entered Alfonso's room with a pillow in his hands. The servants said nothing. The guards turned their backs, and Lucrezia, who had heard the muffled screams through thick walls, stopped praying. They buried Alfonso with the dignity of a prince, and Lucrezia dressed in black for the required number of days. Then she returned to the corridors of power, colder, quieter, and utterly transformed. She did not speak of it. She did not cry. But something inside her had died that day, alongside her husband. And Cesare, he saw it too. The light behind her eyes dimmed. The smile no longer quite reached the corners of her mouth. He had preserved her for himself, but in doing so, he had shattered something essential in her. And still, the Vatican thrived, because the world outside those marble walls saw only glory. They saw Cesare, now Duke of Valentinois, conquering Italian territories with ruthless brilliance. Cities fell before him like dominoes, their princes sent fleeing or bowing. He used terror the way a painter uses colour, deliberately, masterfully. He would hang entire noble families from the battlements to keep a single town in check. He offered peace with one hand and bled cities dry with the other. But even as the blood flowed through the cobbled streets of Romagna, Cesare's mind never drifted far from Lucrezia. He returned to Rome often under the guise of strategy or loyalty. But it was always her, always the way her voice slipped through the air like velvet, how her laughter made the marble seem less cold. He would press his lips to her hand and look into her eyes too long, too openly. The courtiers knew, the servants knew, even the Pope knew, but no one dared speak of it anymore, because Cesare was not just a brother, he was a warlord now, the Pope's sword. Lucrezia, for her part, learned to play the role assigned to her. She smiled at banquets, she posed for portraits, she read scripture to orphans in the daylight and drank wine with her brother in the dark. Their conversations turned inward, shared memories, unspoken regrets, and a bond that had long crossed the boundaries of the natural. There are letters, some real, some perhaps apocryphal, that hint at nights spent in locked rooms, hands clasped too tightly, kisses that tasted more of possession than affection. A necklace, gifted from Cesare, with a locket that held a painted miniature, not of her husband, but of him. The locket was discovered decades later, hidden in a drawer in Ferrara. But no matter how deeply Cesare loved her, he could never fully possess her, because Lucrezia, despite everything, had become something more than a sister. She was a survivor, and survival required sacrifice. So when her father arranged her next marriage, to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, she did not resist. She bowed her head, packed her things, and rode north with the dignity of a queen. Cesare did not follow. Instead, he stood atop the Vatican balcony, watching the procession disappear into the horizon, his face carved from stone. Lucrezia's departure marked a turning point. The Borgia star began to dim. Alexander VI, old and bloated with corruption, died suddenly, poisoned perhaps, or felled by the very decadence he had once wielded like a blade. His death sent shockwaves through the church, and Cesare, his protector gone, found himself vulnerable for the first time in years. Enemies closed in. Allies vanished, and the man who had once seemed invincible now bled like any other. But still, he wrote to Lucrezia, letters that survive, brittle with age, filled with longing and regret, and veiled desperation. He begged her to intercede on his behalf, to send gold, to remember him. But Lucrezia, now Duchess of Ferrara, had built a new life, a respectable life. She had children, a court of her own. She hosted poets and philosophers, built libraries, and commissioned art. She became the cultured noblewoman history now remembers, but the shadow of her past never left her, not entirely, not when it still wrote to her in her brother's hand. When Cesare died, alone, in a skirmish in Navarre, his body was left naked on the field, looted by peasants. No priest came, no brother mourned, no sister wept at his grave. But in her private chapel in Ferrara, Lucrezia lit a candle, just one, and never spoke his name again. The spring of 1499 bleeds across the tiled floors of a Florentine villa, warm light slipping through the leaded glass like a promise and a threat. Outside, the countryside glows with new life. Wild poppies stretch from the roots of broken statues, olive groves ripple under birdsong, and distant thunderheads bloom like gods warring on the horizon. But within these walls, beauty takes a sharper shape, polished, calculated, and cruel. Cesare Borgia stands at the head of a long marble corridor, framed by statues of saints whose eyes seem to watch with carved disapproval. Behind him trails a scent of blood, not fresh, not even physical anymore, but something older, iron-sweet and soaked into the soul. His cape sweeps the ground like the wing of a carrion crow, and beneath it, his steps fall silent. He is no longer a cardinal. That identity was discarded like a blood-soaked robe. Now he is Il Valentino, the Pope's son, the Duke of Valentinois, and the most dangerous man in Italy. He has traded the red robes of the church for the armor of France and the velvet of assassins. Where he once whispered prayers, now he commands mercenaries. Where he once bowed before crucifixes, now he builds pyramids of skulls. The world has shifted on its axis, and Cesare Borgia stands at the center of its spin, dizzy with power, ravenous with ambition. War has begun. Not in whispers or courtly rivalries, but in fire and steel. With the blessing of King Louis XV of France and the deep, bottomless pockets of the Vatican treasury, Cesare launches his brutal Romagna campaign, an unrelenting conquest across the patchwork of Italian principalities. He sweeps through Imola and Forlì like a pestilence, tearing apart the old feudal order with the practiced hand of a surgeon performing vivisection. In Forlì, Caterina Sforza, the Lioness of Milan, barricades herself in a fortress, daring Cesare to come and take it. And take it he does. The siege is swift, violent, merciless. When the gates fall, Cesare rides in like the Reaper himself, and Caterina is dragged before him in chains. stripped not just of her castle, but of her pride, her power, and her voice. He gazes down at her, amused, like a man inspecting a broken statue that once dared to speak. There is no triumph in his eyes, only calculation. This is not personal. Nothing ever is for Cesare anymore. At his side during these campaigns rides a strange mirror image of himself. Not a warrior, not a prince, but his younger brother, Joffre, or sometimes more unsettlingly, Lucrezia's current husband, Alfonso of Aragon. Cesare treats both men with a peculiar blend of cold camaraderie and condescending threat. Alfonso, in particular, bears the brunt of it. A man whose only sin was marrying Lucrezia in a political union, orchestrated by their father, Pope Alexander VI. But Cesare sees no difference between political obstacles and personal insults. And in the candle-lit corridors of the Vatican, rumors twist tighter around the Borgia siblings with every breath. Lucrezia writes to Cesare constantly. Her letters are filled with longing, devotion, and unsettling warmth. She refers to him in tones more suited to lovers than to brothers. My soul, she calls him, the half of me that lives far away. The handwriting curves like a caress. When Cesare reads them, something unreadable passes through his expression, an old ache or a new plan. Whispers grow into stories. Stories become scandal. At banquets across Italy, nobles trade jokes about the Pope's daughter and her brother. They call her the Bride of Rome, but they don't mean it in reverence. They speak of secret meetings, of the strange intimacy they share, of the way her eyes follow Cesare across a room like a compass locked on a single magnetic point. She has borne a child out of wedlock, and no one dares say the name of the father. But Cesare has no patience for whispers. In July of 1500, Alfonso of Aragon is found lying in a pool of his own blood, stabbed outside St. Peter's Basilica. He clings to life for days, whimpering prayers through broken teeth as Lucrezia tends to him, her hands trembling, her eyes hollowed by fear and fury. She begs her father, the Pope, to protect her husband. She swears vengeance on whoever ordered the attack. But nothing moves in the Vatican without Cesare's permission. Then one morning, the guards assigned to Alfonso's chamber vanish. A single figure enters with a thin scarf and a surgeon's silence. When Lucrezia returns, she finds her husband's corpse cooling beneath a window that no longer opens. The official cause of death is listed as exhaustion. But every soul in Rome knows better. Cesare does not deny it. Lucrezia wears mourning black for a year. She attends mass with silent tears clinging to her lashes. And then one night during a private feast, Cesare appears beside her in a cloak soaked with rain, places a ring on her finger, and whispers something into her ear that makes her face go pale. History leaves the words unrecorded, but she does not remove the ring. Rome itself groans beneath the weight of these sins. Murmurs echo through the catacombs. Priests who once praised the Borgia name now shiver during confession. And Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, father of them all, sits upon the throne of St. Peter with hollow eyes and trembling hands. He has built an empire out of gold and blood, out of secrets and silence. But something in him has shifted, buckled beneath the sins he once wielded like weapons. He tries to marry Lucrezia off again, this time to Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara. The Este family resists, aware of the growing stench around the Borgia name. Lucrezia, now widowed twice over, smiles through negotiations with all the grace of a woman who has learned to bleed politely. But behind her smile is steel. She secures the marriage. She always does. And Cesare watches from a shadowed balcony, clapping slowly, as though the whole world were merely a stage built for his sister's tragedies. But even tragedies end, and this one is barreling toward its final act. As Cesare continues his campaigns, conquering town after town with a mixture of terror and charm, the world begins to shift beneath his feet. The Pope is aging. Whispers of poisoning swirl like smoke. Enemies gather in the north, and allies begin to turn their coats. Rome, once his playground, now watches him with narrowed eyes, and Lucrezia, now Duchess of Ferrara, begins to write fewer letters. The boy who once dreamed of being Pope now dreams only of survival. But dreams, like empires, are fragile things, and Cesare Borgia is about to learn just how far a shadow can stretch when the sun begins to set. The summer of 1503 hangs heavy over Rome, thick with heat and secrets. Flies swarm the fountains, the Tiber runs slow, bloated with sewage, and the discarded sins of a city cracking beneath its own hypocrisy. In the papal apartments, the air smells of incense and rotting fruit, and somewhere deeper, beneath the marble, behind the tapestries, something darker festers. Pope Alexander VI lies on his deathbed. It comes suddenly. A banquet, a fever, a collapse. Some whisper poison, others blame the sweltering Roman heat. But the truth is far more brutal. The body simply gives out. After decades of gluttony, greed, lust, and ambition, the flesh cannot carry the burden anymore. Rodrigo Borgia, the man who bought the papacy, who fathered children from within the robes of Christ, who turned the Vatican into a palace of corruption, now lies shaking, slick with sweat, babbling prayers too late to matter. Cesare is with him when it happens, watching, not weeping. He kneels at his father's side, not like a son, but like a general assessing the fall of a fortress. The Pope's hand reaches for his, trembling fingers stained with invisible blood, and for a moment there is no power, no sin, no throne, just a father dying in front of the only child he ever truly loved. But love dies with the last breath. The moment Pope Alexander exhales for the final time, the world changes. Instantly. The Vatican guards who once bowed to Cesare now avoid his gaze. Cardinals murmur behind closed doors. Alliances evaporate like morning mist. Cesare, once untouchable, now finds the floor of the city shifting beneath his boots. He is not Pope, he is not noble by birth. And now, without his father, he is not safe. His enemies move quickly. The Orsini, the Colonna, the d'Este in Ferrara, who would sooner burn the world than see a Borgia rise again. The French crown, once his greatest ally, begins to look elsewhere. Cesare, weakened by illness himself, some say he caught the same fever that killed his father, staggers under the weight of collapsing power. He retreats to Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress that looms over the Tiber like a mausoleum for failed ambition. From its battlements, he watches Rome prepare for a new pope, a new era, one that does not include him. He sends letters, bribes, threats, but the tide has turned. And in Ferrara, Lucrezia watches in silence. She is married now, properly, royally. She has learned to speak like a duchess, to move like a queen, to bleed only when no one can see. Her letters to Cesare grow fewer, shorter, colder, not because she no longer loves him, but because she knows, somewhere deep in the part of her that learned to survive, that the Borgia name is poison, and Cesare is its bitterest dose. But she dreams of him still. She dreams of their childhood, of that warm Roman sun spilling over Vatican tiles, of his hand in hers, of whispered secrets in hidden gardens, of stolen glances that lasted too long, of the taste of forbidden devotion. And when she wakes, she does not cry. She dresses, she prays, and she walks into the world as if her soul weren't bruised beneath her silks. Cesare, meanwhile, gambles everything on one final hope: the conclave. He believes he can influence the papal election, that he can puppet a new pope, as his father did. But he is wrong. The cardinals elect Giuliano della Rovere, Pope Julius II, a man who has loathed the Borgias for decades, who once called Alexander the whore pope, and who now holds the keys to heaven and hell. Cesare is stripped of power, his lands are seized, his titles erased, he is arrested, imprisoned, exiled, but he does not die. No, Cesare Borgia does not die quietly in a Roman cell. He escapes, flees to Spain, begs for scraps of power from kings who once feared him. And in 1507, 4 years after the death of his father, Cesare rides into battle one last time, in the service of the King of Navarre, fighting rebels in the hills of Viana. It is raining. The earth is mud. The sky a bruise. Cesare wears borrowed armor and commands a force of mercenaries who barely remember his name. During a skirmish, he chases fleeing soldiers into a narrow ravine. He is cut off from his men, surrounded, dismounted. They stab him 32 times. When they strip his corpse, they find nothing but a purse of coins and a charm bearing Lucrezia's name. He dies alone, in a foreign land, with no banner, no throne, no god to protect him. The man who once reshaped Italy with blood and ambition ends his life face down in the dirt, trampled by horses and forgotten by history, at least forgotten by the part of history that prefers heroes to monsters. Back in Ferrara, when word reaches Lucrezia, she says nothing. She walks into the cathedral, she lights a candle, she kneels, and she whispers a name that no one hears. Not Cesare, not Il Valentino, just my brother. The rest of her life passes like a shadow. She bears children, hosts festivals, rules with grace, but behind her eyes there is always that ghost. The Vatican scrubs the records. The new popes pretend the Borgias never existed. Artists repaint the frescoes. Priests write new sermons. But somewhere in the stone bones of Rome, their names remain. Cesare and Lucrezia. Not as sinners, not as saints, as something more human, more tragic, more real. A brother and sister, born into a world of corruption, trapped beneath the weight of expectation, twisted by love that dared to cross a line. Their story is not about evil, it is about the price of power, about what happens when the church forgets mercy, when love forgets its limits, when ambition forgets the soul. And what remains, long after the palaces fall and the blood is washed away, is not just scandal or legend, but grief. Cold, quiet grief for what could have been, and what never had a chance to be. It begins with silence, thick and unnatural, the kind that coats the walls of stone corridors and hangs low over a garden long after the birds have stopped singing. The Vatican feels different now. The once opulent court of Pope Alexander VI no longer pulses with unrestrained celebration, nor echoes with the sly laughter of guests too full of wine to sense the rot beneath the marble. There is instead an air of waiting, like a breath held too long. For Cesare is returning, and the walls, no matter how gilded, know blood when they taste it. The campaigns had changed him. That much was visible in the tautness of his skin, the way his shoulders hunched like a beast ready to spring, and the weariness in his eyes, buried behind the arrogance, yes, but visible to those who had known him before. The man who returned from Romagna was not the same golden-haired cardinal who once smiled as he delivered blessings with fingers still red from punishment. He was now Il Valentino, warrior prince, terror of the countryside, draped in a black cloak that clung like shadow and smelled faintly of smoke. But deeper than his armor, deeper even than the scars he would never reveal, there lay a fracture. Lucrezia felt it the moment he embraced her again. He was harder now. not just in muscle and temperament, but in distance. His hand lingered on her back, longer than it should have. His cheek brushed hers and paused, not quite a kiss, not quite a hesitation. When she pulled back, searching his face for something familiar, he only smiled. A smile that was meant to reassure. A smile that said nothing at all. Cesare had seen death. He had dealt it out like confetti from a balcony, decisive and brutal, until cities folded before him and enemies bled themselves dry in their eagerness to be spared. He had conquered in the Pope's name. But power has a scent, and it clung to him now more than incense ever had. Lucretia could smell it as he passed, the sharp tang of steel, blood, and sanctified corruption. Still, the court rejoiced. For who could fear a Borgia return triumphant? In the gardens of Castel Sant'Angelo, musicians played beneath tapestries depicting saints whose eyes were always looking away. Tables overflowed with fruit and wine, the dark claret of the latter staining the mouths of cardinals who blessed each sip. Alexander VI stood at the head of it all, his face shining, not with holiness, but pride, a father basking in the ruin his son had wrought. Lucrezia sat beside her brother. She wore green that day, the color of spring, and a necklace of pearls that once belonged to their mother. Her laughter came in measured bursts, polite and false, like a harpsichord tuned a note too sharp. Cesare watched her more than he watched the festivities. His gloved fingers drummed a rhythm only he could hear. She caught him looking and, for a moment, dared to ask, "Do you ever regret what you've done?" His eyes didn't leave hers. "Do you?" What could she say to that? They had both made choices. Some were born from necessity, others from hunger. Still others had no name at all. But there are some acts that drag the soul behind them like a broken cart. Among them was Alfonso, Lucrezia's husband, her second, if one counted the annulled union her father orchestrated when she was barely more than a girl. Alfonso of Aragon, Prince of Naples, had been young, soft-eyed, and foolishly in love. He had believed the marriage was more than alliance, more than ink on parchment and papal approval. He had believed she had chosen him. She had tried to. But Cesare hated him. No, it was more complicated than that. Cesare resented Alfonso for existing, for being allowed to touch what he considered his. And though the union was blessed by Pope Alexander himself, though it had served its political purpose, it had also birthed a threat. Naples would not yield to the papacy forever. And so a decision was made, not openly, not signed or sealed, but whispered between teeth and followed by silence. Alfonso was attacked one evening on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. 3 men, faces hidden beneath cloaks, blades drawn with the practiced grace of men who had killed before. The prince fought, bravely it is said, but not well. He was left bleeding in the street, lungs pierced, ribs shattered. It was assumed he would die. He did not. He lingered. And that, Lucretia would come to understand, was the true mistake. For death would have been swift. Lingering allowed hope. It allowed suspicion. And it forced Cesare to finish what his shadows had begun. Lucretia had stayed at Alfonso's bedside. She had washed the blood from his skin and wept into his hands. She had begged her father to intervene, to protect him. Alexander had kissed her forehead and said nothing. Cesare came to visit only once. He brought no wine, no condolences, only a pillow. The murder was silent, the screams muffled. When Lucrezia returned, Alfonso was cold. The nurses said his wounds had taken him. She knew better. Her scream could be heard through all of Rome. For 3 days, she locked herself away, refusing food or comfort, tearing the green dress to shreds and throwing the pearls into the Tiber. But grief is not armor, and memory is not justice. When she emerged again, It was with her face set like marble. She smiled at her brother, and he kissed her cheek. Cesare was never punished. How could he be? What law governs a prince who lives beneath the roof of God's vicar? They say Lucrezia never forgave him. But the truth is more complicated. Forgiveness implies boundaries. In their world, love and hate had become the same color, blending until it was impossible to tell which one painted her tears. She married again. Another union crafted for diplomacy, Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. He was cautious, calculating, and just distant enough to offer her safety. But she carried the ghost of Cesare with her, even into that cold northern court. Every glance she offered, every hesitation in her voice, whispered his name even when she swore never to speak it. Cesare, for his part, continued his campaigns. More blood, more conquest, more lands added to the papal map, but the light in his eyes had dimmed. Something had broken between them, perhaps with Alfonso's murder, perhaps earlier. And though the rumors never stopped, about the nights they disappeared together, about the soft cries heard behind her chamber doors, there was a space now between their souls that no touch could mend. He wrote her letters. She never answered. She sent gifts. He never wore them. Their love had become a monument, something beautiful, something monstrous, too large to live, but too sacred to destroy. And in that silence, history began to judge. The people whispered of sin, of unnatural love, of a pope who broke his vows and children who broke the world. But inside those whispers were truths they could never understand, because for all their cruelty, the Borgias were never simple villains. They were survivors, born into corruption, raised on ambition, driven not by evil but by necessity. And still, within all that filth, there had once been moments of something like love. It would be easy to end here, to wrap the tale with the convenient burial of scandal beneath time's indifferent dust. But history is not kind, and Rome does not forget. The ghosts still walk the corridors of the Vatican. Their footsteps echo in marble halls where candles flicker too suddenly, where portraits hang askew for no reason, where the wind sounds too much like a sigh, and if you listen closely, you can still hear a girl's voice, begging, not for justice, not even for peace, but for her brother to stop. Just once. Under the velvet canopy of midnight Rome, torches flicker through narrow alleys soaked in wine and secrets. The marble palaces that line the Tiber seem to breathe, as if the city itself watches from the shadows, bearing witness to what the world must never truly see. Within the hallowed halls of the Vatican, incense coils in slow spirals, sweetening the stench of sin that no censer could ever smother. It is here, in the echoing silence of sacred chambers, that Cesare Borgia walks barefoot over chilled stone, the weight of silk and steel on his shoulders, his breath tight in his throat, not from prayer, but from hunger, from something darker, something he knows he should not want and yet cannot unsee. By now, the veil between devotion and desire has all but torn. Cesare, once the Cardinal Prince, has laid aside his vestments for a sword, and with it, he has carved his own empire from the broken bones of men who dared cross his gaze. But no bloodied battlefield, no whispering council, no excommunication carries the weight of the secret he holds behind his teeth. His sister, Lucrezia, no longer feels like the reflection of his family. She is the mirror of his own longing, the haunting chorus behind every ambition, every monstrous choice. They had danced too close to the fire for too long, and now neither could recall where brother ended and lover began. Rumors slither like serpents through the courts of Europe. Every noble tongue tastes the same poison, that the daughter of Pope Alexander VI is no innocent, and her child, Lucrezia's pale, golden-haired boy, bears a face that is not quite unfamiliar. The Pope, with his terrible brilliance, declares the child his own, then changes his claim by moonlight. assigning it to Cesare, then rescinding again, as if reshaping truth by decree. The child becomes a ghost in official records, a political spectre the papal court pretends to forget. But no amount of rewritten parchment can silence the knowing looks of those who witnessed how often Cesare lingered in his sister's chambers, how often their voices rose through the walls, not in argument, but in something softer, more desperate. Lucrezia, married and remarried like a pawn across Europe's chessboard, now lives in Ferrara, her face painted with the calm of diplomacy, her stomach full of bile. She has known the touch of 3 husbands, but none like Cesare. Their first parting had been quiet and unspoken, the kind of farewell born of political necessity rather than true intent. But when he returned, bloodied from conquest, teeth bared from triumph, he had ridden into her estate like a storm. That night, she had not resisted. She had opened her arms, trembling, and drawn him into the life she had buried, not as a sister, not as a duchess, but as a woman who could no longer pretend that what bound them was anything but ruin. What made it worse, what truly twisted the blade, was how easy it had become. In public, they performed their roles perfectly. Cesare spoke of her with reverence, as a brother should. Lucrezia smiled with just enough reserve to convince. They held court as the perfect image of papal nobility. But behind closed doors, they were animals, starved, poisoned, devouring each other to survive. Even the servants knew. One, a young maid from Naples, had seen too much, heard too much. She had fled, trembling into the night, only to be found days later, her throat slit, her eyes open in terror. Her death had been ruled an accident. The city whispered otherwise, and through it all, Pope Alexander VI remained silent. Not because he was blind, but because he was complicit. The man who had fathered 4 children in open defiance of his vows, who had raised his offspring not as spiritual charges, but as political extensions of himself, saw in their love a mirror of his own sins. He did not chastise. He did not intervene. He watched. He guided, and above all, he used them. For Lucrezia's beauty opened doors to alliances, and Cesare's brilliance and brutality sealed them. But now the cracks are widening. Cesare's health is failing. His once golden skin turns grey beneath his armor. He drinks more. He laughs less. Nightmares claw at him, and he wakes with blood beneath his nails. The syphilis he contracted in his younger years, long dormant, begins to rot him from within. Physicians whisper of lesions, of hallucinations, of madness creeping behind his eyes. He rages without cause. He weeps without shame. And when he visits Lucrezia, he clutches her hands as if she alone anchors him to the realm of the living. Lucrezia, for her part, has grown cold. Not unfeeling, never that, but colder than before. Resigned, she spends hours in her garden, hands sunk in the soil, whispering to the earth. Her letters to Rome grow fewer, her visits more distant. When Cesare arrives, she greets him with a smile that no longer reaches her eyes. But still she opens her door. Still she opens her arms, because some poisons, once swallowed, become part of your blood. And yet, even within this downward spiral, Cesare continues to build. He conquers Romagna with an iron grip, tortures rebels with the precision of a surgeon, and burns disloyal captains alive to warm the loyalty of others. The people call him cruel. Machiavelli calls him brilliant. The Pope calls him son. But Cesare no longer hears them. He listens only to the heartbeat of something far more fragile, far more dangerous. Lucrezia's voice in his mind, her memory in his bed, her absence gnawing at the corners of his sanity. On one bitter winter night, as snow silences the streets of Ferrara, Cesare arrives unannounced, sick, feverish, his cloak heavy with frost and sweat. He falls into her arms like a dying animal. and Lucrezia, weeping, carries him to her bed, knowing that this may be the last time he draws breath beneath her roof. She washes his face with trembling hands. She sings the lullabies of their childhood. She begs him to stay, though her heart knows he won't. And he, half mad with fever, confesses everything, not just to her, but to the walls, to the angels above, to the God he once served and now curses. He confesses that he has murdered for her, lied for her, that he has prayed not for salvation, but for one more night in her arms, that if he had to live it all again, he would not change a thing. Then at last, his body slackens, the fever breaks, and for one terrible moment, they believe he has died. But he breathes again. Barely, and in the days that follow, Cesare Borgia is sent back to Rome, cloaked in silence and carried by men who do not speak. Lucrezia does not follow. She stands in the doorway of her estate, watching the carriage vanish into the grey, because she knows, better than anyone, that death is not always swift. Sometimes it arrives in pieces. Sometimes it walks beside you for years before you feel its touch. The streets of Rome weep beneath the weight of a fading dynasty. The marble gleams, but the blood has not washed away, not from the stones, nor from the memory of the city that bore witness to the Borgia name rising, burning, and breaking like a fever. The air is thicker now, as if time itself pauses to hold its breath in anticipation of the fall that everyone saw coming, but no one could prevent. The bells of St. Peter's toll like funeral chimes, not for a body, but for an empire of desire wrapped in papal robes. The palace once so alive with laughter, feasts, and whispered obscenities, now echoes with silence and rot. Cesare Borgia, once the golden son of the Holy Father, the general of Rome's destiny, stares at the pieces he once held so tightly, slipping through his blood-stained fingers. After Alexander VI's death in 1503, everything begins to collapse like a dam cracking under pressure. Pope Julius II, his bitter enemy, rises with vengeance already coiled like a serpent in his chest. Cesare is sick, ravaged by disease and the failure of his body to match the fire of his ambition. Syphilis leaves his skin blotched and his mind flickering between lucidity and delirium. His legendary strength, the armor-clad body that once cut through Italy like a blade, now lies in bed soaked in sweat and shame. Betrayed by allies he once ruled, deserted by men who once kissed the hem of his cloak, Cesare is captured in Naples and imprisoned in Spain. He had once stood at the right hand of God, his father declared divine. He had been dressed in scarlet, cloaked in whispers, feared by princes, adored by artists, envied by devils. And now he's alone in a cell. Rats gnaw at the wood, dust coats the golden threads of the tunic he still wears out of stubborn defiance. His dreams taunt him. Visions of Lucrezia smiling beneath the red canopy of the papal gardens, of her slender fingers reaching for his face, of the look in her eyes that never left him, even when the rest of the world did. Lucrezia, the sister who once held his hand and whispered that the world would always belong to them, is now far from Rome. She's a duchess now, of Ferrara, her name scrubbed clean by distance and time, adorned with pearls, with children, with a husband who may never fully know the woman he married. And yet she cannot forget him. Letters are burned, memories buried, but there are nights she wakes in cold sweat, haunted by the soft brush of fingers that had no right to touch her the way they once did. She mourns him before he is dead, because in truth, part of her died with him, buried beneath years of guilt, of powerlessness, of the lies told by men in God's name. Back in Spain, Cesare escapes. It's almost mythic in how it unfolds. Ropes from a window, disguises, darkness, but destiny, once tamed by his arrogance, now coils back around his neck. He makes it as far as Navarre, where his final war begins. For all his flaws, he dies as he lived, in armor, sword in hand, charging into battle like a man who believes the world still bends to his will. But this time, there are no trumpets, no banners, no father's blessing from the balcony of the Vatican. Just rain, mud, and betrayal. He is struck down defending a castle for a cause that isn't his. His body is stripped of armor, left naked in the dirt. A final humiliation for the boy who once believed he could carve history with blood and charm. They bury him beneath the steps of a church in Vienna, his name trampled daily by the faithful, not in marble, not in gold, but in dust. Later, the clergy dig him up, claiming the sinner does not belong in sacred ground. His bones are cast out, scattered, forgotten. But the story never dies, because the Borgia name is more than history. It's a wound in the skin of the church, a ghost in the halls of power, a mirror held to human depravity wearing holy clothes. Cesare, with all his cruelty and charm, with his lips on his sister's mouth and blood on his sword, remains the most haunting reminder of what happens when men mistake power for divinity. And Lucrezia, she outlives him, builds a life, a family, a legacy carefully polished to hide the cracks. But inside her, the weight of it all never leaves. She dies at 39, her body worn from childbirth, her heart heavier still. In her final hours, they say she prays, not for salvation, but for silence, for the memories to fade, for the past to forgive her what history never will. Their story ends not with fire, but with ash. A final whisper carried through cathedrals and palaces and stone, echoing down centuries, that no throne built on secrets, no love fed by sin can escape the judgment of time. And yet, we still look. We still stare into that darkness, unable to turn away. Because buried in that scandal, beneath the velvet robes and altar smoke, is the part of us that wonders, how close have we come to becoming them? And what would we have done with the power to never be punished? The Borgias are gone, but the hunger that made them still lingers in every seat of power the world has ever known.